When we think of world wars, our minds often gravitate towards the two monumental conflicts that reshaped the 20th century. However, nearly 2 centuries earlier, in the mid-1700s, the world witnessed the eruption of what could arguably be deemed the first true global war in human history. This colossal confrontation spanned continents, from the battlefields of Europe to the frontier lands of North America, from the sun-drenched islands of the Caribbean to the expansive plains of India. Nations such as Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Sweden and Portugal, along with a vast array of indigenous American and Indian allies, clashed in a struggle that would not only redefine the balance of power in Europe, but also shape the future of colonial empires across the world. This epic conflict, waged between 1756 and 1763, witnessed the dissolution of long-standing alliances and the emergence of new power players on the world stage. But what was the spark that ignited such a vast and unprecedented war? How did a seemingly minor territorial dispute on the North American frontier escalate into a struggle that consumed much of the known world? This is the story of the 7 Years' War. The origins of the 7 Years' War can be traced to the residual tensions left in the wake of earlier 18th century conflicts, particularly those between the two dominant dynastic houses of the era, the Bourbon monarchy of France and the Habsburg rulers of Austria. For half a century, these two colossal powers vied for supremacy over Europe, each seeking to tip the delicate balance of power in its favour. One of the most significant precursors to the 7 Years' War was the War of the Austrian Succession, fought between 1740 and 1748. In that struggle, European powers aligned themselves according to a well-established system of alliances. Austria found itself supported by Great Britain, the Dutch Republic, Russia, and the German electorate of Hanover, ruled in personal union by Britain's Georgian monarchs. Meanwhile, Prussia, France's frequent ally and Austria's chief rival in Germany, found support from Spain, Sweden, and other minor European states. The war itself was fought over the rightful succession of Maria Theresa to the Austrian throne, and though inconclusive, led to a major territorial shift. Austria lost the wealthy province of Silesia to Prussia under the ambitious King Frederick the Great. Despite the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748, which formally ended the War of the Austrian Succession, many of the underlying rivalries between the great powers remained unresolved. By 1756, the traditional European alliance system had begun to unravel in what historians refer to as the diplomatic revolution. Anti-British sentiment grew within the Austrian court, fueled by Britain's insistence on prioritising the defence of Hanover over Austrian interests in the Netherlands. This frustration led Empress Maria Theresa to seek an unexpected rapprochement with her long-standing enemy, France. Meanwhile, Britain, sensing growing hostility from France, sought a new continental ally and turned to Prussia. A secret pact was brokered between Britain and Frederick the Great, wherein Britain promised financial and logistical support in exchange for Prussia's commitment to safeguarding Hanover. Russia, wary of Prussia's territorial ambitions, reaffirmed its alliance with Austria, while the Dutch Republic, seeing a reduced threat from France due to its newfound friendship with Austria, declared its neutrality. These shifting allegiances set the stage for renewed conflict, not only in Europe but in colonial territories across the globe, where Britain and France were locked in an intense rivalry. By the mid-18th century, European colonial ambitions had expanded dramatically, particularly between the British and French empires. These two great powers vied for dominance wherever their overseas interests intersected. In India, both the British and French East India companies had become powerful players, vying for influence among local rulers while protecting their economic interests through private armies composed of both European and native Indian soldiers. Their struggle for dominance in the region had already erupted into violent clashes known as the Carnatic Wars, conflicts that often mirrored the hostilities taking place in Europe. However, it was in North America where tensions between Britain and France reached their breaking point, leading to the first shots of the 7 Years' War. For over a century, both nations had established and expanded their North American dominions. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled 13 prosperous colonies along the eastern seaboard, stretching from Georgia to Maine, as well as the territories of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, acquired from France in a previous war. France, meanwhile, laid claim to an expansive swath of land, encompassing the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes region, and the vast Mississippi River basin down to the Gulf of Mexico. The precise boundaries between these colonial possessions remained loosely defined, but both sides were eager to prevent encroachment by the other. Determined to protect their territorial claims, the French constructed a network of forts, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, to act as barriers against British expansion. One of the most contentious of these outposts was Fort Duquesne, established in 1754 at what is now modern-day Pittsburgh. Britain initially sought to resolve what it viewed as French encroachment through diplomatic means. However, when these efforts failed, the British authorities authorized military action to dislodge the French presence. Leading this expedition was a young and ambitious 21-year-old Virginia militia officer, George Washington, who would later become a pivotal figure in American history. Washington and his troops, accompanied by Native American allies, engaged a small French force near Fort Duquesne in what became known as the Battle of 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏 on May 28, 1754. This skirmish ended in the death of the French commander, escalating tensions dramatically. The French retaliated on July 3, 1754, attacking Washington's hastily constructed Fort Necessity, forcing him to surrender. Although war had yet to be officially declared, these clashes marked the beginning of what became known in North America as the French and Indian War, a conflict that would soon spiral into the broader global struggle of the 7 Years' War. News of these engagements spread slowly across the Atlantic, but by August reports had reached Britain, igniting public outrage and fueling calls for military intervention. Propaganda on both sides painted differing versions of events, each blaming the other for the outbreak of hostilities. Recognizing that open conflict was inevitable, both Britain and France dispatched troops to reinforce their North American holdings. Britain's first significant move came with the attack on Acadia on June 16, 1755, followed by the forced expulsion of French settlers from the region, a brutal action that displaced thousands. In July of that same year, British Major General Edward Braddock led a force of over 2,000 troops, including provincial militia, on a mission to capture Fort Duquesne. However, the campaign ended in disaster when Braddock's army was ambushed and decisively defeated, with Braddock himself suffering mortal wounds. Subsequent engagements, such as the inconclusive Battle of Lake George in September 1755, underscored the growing scale of the conflict. Though formal declarations of war would not come until 1756, these early clashes in the North American wilderness set the stage for what would become the first truly global war. a war that would ultimately redraw maps, dismantle empires, and shape the course of history for generations to come. This is the story of the 7 Years' War, a conflict whose repercussions would echo far beyond the battlefields of the 18th century, shaping the modern world in ways few could have foreseen. Meanwhile, at sea, the British intensified their efforts against French naval operations. On June 8th, Admiral Edward Boscawen launched an attack on the French vessel Alcide, successfully capturing it along with 2 troop transports destined for the defence of Quebec. In addition to this engagement, the British commandeered numerous merchant vessels, detained thousands of sailors, and implemented blockades along French coastlines, all while the two nations remained technically at peace. France retaliated in April 1756 by launching an offensive against the British-held island of Minorca in the Mediterranean. This prompted Britain to officially declare war on France on May 17th and dispatch a naval contingent, led by Admiral John Byng, to relieve the besieged garrison. However, Byng's engagement with the French resulted in an inconclusive battle, leading to his retreat and ultimately allowing Minorca to fall. Back in Britain, his failure caused a political outcry, culminating in his court-martial and execution by firing squad the following year for not exerting his utmost efforts against the enemy. The war formally escalated when France declared hostilities in June, yet the most consequential battles in Europe stemmed from tensions between Prussia and Austria over Silesia. Determined to retain control over the region, Frederick the Great of Prussia, having secured an alliance with Britain, preemptively invaded Saxony in August 1756. His strategic vision involved a swift incursion into Austrian-controlled Bohemia before potential Russian interference from the east could materialize. However, his plans met with resistance at the Battle of Lobositz on October 1st, where Austrian forces under General Maximilian Ulysses Braun successfully repelled the Prussian advance. The Prussians subsequently spent much of the following year attempting to break through in Bohemia. They nearly succeeded at the Battle of Prague in May 1757, only to be thwarted at the Battle of Kolin in June. With Prussian forces concentrated against Austria, the French seized the opportunity to invade Hanover, a German territory under British influence. In July, the Duke of Cumberland, son of King George II, suffered defeat at the hands of the French under the Duc d'Estrées at the Battle of Hastenbeck. Consequently, Hanover capitulated under the Convention of Klosterzeven. Meanwhile, in the east, Russian forces led by Field Marshal Apraksin advanced into East Prussia, capturing the strategic fortress of Memel. This series of setbacks placed Prussia in an increasingly precarious position, prompting Sweden to enter the war against Prussia on September 22nd with an invasion of Pomerania. By the end of 1757, Prussia appeared on the verge of collapse. Yet, Frederick the Great executed a stunning series of military reversals. First, he delivered a decisive victory at the Battle of Rossbach on November 5th, where his forces, despite being outnumbered nearly 2-1, overwhelmed a Franco-German army. The following month, he defeated a numerically superior Austrian force at the Battle of Leuthen, further cementing his reputation as one of Europe's preeminent military tacticians. Turning north, he then expelled the Swedish army from Prussian territory, seizing Swedish Pomerania in the process. While these battles raged across Europe, conflicts also erupted in India. The British and French East India Companies vied for dominance over the subcontinent, aligning with local rulers to expand their influence. A pivotal engagement occurred on June 23, 1757, at the Battle of Plassey. British forces under Robert Clive, supported by Indian allies, decisively defeated the Bengali ruler 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗁 and his French-backed forces. This victory marked the beginning of British hegemony in Bengal and signalled a turning point in European colonial competition in India. Over the following years, British forces continued their expansion, with Sir Eyre Coote's army triumphing at the Battle of 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗁 in 1760, leading to the fall of the French stronghold of Pondicherry in 1761 and effectively ending French influence in the region. Meanwhile, in North America, initial French successes in capturing Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757 were overshadowed by Britain's numerical and logistical superiority. The population disparity between the British colonies, approximately 2 million, and New France, barely 100,000, became increasingly apparent as the war progressed. By 1758, British forces secured key victories, including the capture of Fort Duquesne and Fort Frontenac, as well as the crucial fortress of Louisbourg in July. Though the French scored a tactical victory at the Battle of Carillon, it proved a fleeting success as British forces continued to gain ground. This shift in momentum was largely attributed to the leadership of William Pitt, Britain's Secretary of State, who advocated for substantial financial and military investments in Prussia while directing British naval power towards French colonial assets. Recognizing the strategic importance of the Caribbean, Britain launched an offensive against France's lucrative sugar-producing islands. In early 1759, British forces initially targeted Martinique, but shifted their focus to Guadeloupe, which they successfully captured despite severe tropical diseases ravaging their ranks. That same year, British naval dominance was demonstrated in Africa, when a flotilla seized French trading posts in Senegal. At sea, the Royal Navy thwarted French invasion plans. The Battle of Lagos in August 1759 saw a British squadron under Edward Boscawen scatter the French Mediterranean fleet. This was followed by the Battle of Quiberon Bay in November, where Admiral Edward Hawke decisively destroyed the French Brest fleet, eliminating any possibility of an invasion of Britain. In North America, British forces secured the most consequential victory of the war at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13, 1759. Under the command of Major General James Wolfe, British troops defeated the forces of French General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, leading to the capture of Quebec and the eventual fall of New France. Both commanders perished in the battle, marking a dramatic turning point in the war. Despite Britain's successes, Prussia faced severe challenges. A crushing defeat at the Battle of 𝗥𝗲𝗹𝗁 on August 12, 1759, nearly ended Frederick's reign as his army collapsed against a combined Austrian-Russian force. However, diplomatic shifts proved crucial. The death of Russian Empress Elizabeth in January 1762 brought Peter III, a Prussian sympathizer, to the throne. Russia then withdrew from the war and aligned with Prussia, followed shortly by Sweden. These developments enabled Frederick to regain lost territory, most notably in Silesia. Meanwhile, Spain, under Charles III, entered the war in 1762, fearing British dominance in the Americas. However, this intervention proved disastrous. British forces launched an invasion of Cuba, capturing Havana after a prolonged siege. Simultaneously, an expedition to the Philippines resulted in the fall of Manila. Spanish and French attempts to invade Portugal also failed. Within months, Spain suffered significant territorial losses, leading to its effective defeat. By 1763, exhausted from years of warfare, all belligerents sought peace. The Treaty of Hubertusburg restored the status quo between Prussia and Austria. More significantly, the Treaty of Paris redrew colonial boundaries. Britain gained Canada, Florida, and various overseas territories, while France retained its valuable Caribbean possessions. Although the war ended, its consequences reverberated for decades. Britain's financial strain led to increased taxation in the American colonies, sowing discontent that ultimately sparked the American Revolution. Simultaneously, France, humiliated by its losses, sought an opportunity to challenge British supremacy, setting the stage for future conflicts that would reshape the global order.